Robert is a professor of psychiatry at Columbia University and leads the school's Bioethics Masters Program. He researches the ethical issues around new scientific discoveries, including the genetic alteration of embryos.
It had been on the periphery as some people thought science fiction, that one day we may be able to alter the genes of embryos. And of course, there have been science fiction movies like Gattaca and of course Brave New World, in which there have been depictions of technology really dramatically altering how we create children and what we do with that information. But we have this technology that's really an extension or part of assisted reproductive technology where we can actually go into an embryo and alter the genes. And we could turn on genes, turn off genes. We could get rid of certain diseases, or we can add genes that are associated with height or with blonde hair, blue eyes, or with certain musical abilities or certain athletic abilities. So that opens up this whole additional world of questions that we now will increasingly face.
Robert has published more than 120 scientific articles and 8 books, including Designing Babies, How Technology is Changing the Ways We Create Children. I met Robert on the campus of Columbia University in New York City before the pandemic. Dr. Klitzman, I want to talk about designing babies, but I also want to talk about designing a book. And you have to grab the reader, and this is how you start your book. Do you want to be the father of my child? A friend, Abby, asked me a few years ago. I was in after that. I mean, it was a great way to start the book, and it really kind of illustrates the whole new world that we live in, isn't it?
Yes, so as I described in the book, a friend of mine said, basically, do you want to be a sperm donor? And this is someone who I went to college with, and we were friends, but we saw each other maybe 2-3 times a year over recent years. So I was surprised. It's not like we were bosom buddies and hung out together all the time. And when she asked me that, it made me think, I don't have children of my own. And so did I want to have a child in this way? And she said, basically, I just need your sperm. You don't have to be involved. You don't have to pay any money. And I'll raise the child. And then I thought, well, what would that be like to have a child that I have no connection to, but might look just like me and have lots of my traits, and so be part of me, part of my genes being carried on. And so I began to look into this. And of course, other people I know you hear about people who are sperm sellers, egg donors, et cetera, but it had never crossed my path. I've never had to make that decision. And so it made me suddenly think about the broad range of issues involved today, given all these advances in IVF and assisted reproductive technologies.
Over the decades, reproductive technologies have grown in popularity for various reasons. Rising numbers of single parents and same-sex couples, more women pursuing their careers and waiting to have a baby, as well as the ability of parents to screen embryos for specific traits. And it also gets into a whole question of if I'm wealthy, I can have the certain child. If I'm poor, I mean, it's the whole ethical range, isn't it?
Yes, correct. So there are huge issues of social justice, basically, that there's, unfortunately, in many countries, always going to be a division between the wealthy and the poor. Many of us think that gets to be a major problem at a certain point, that we should aim to have justice, that we should aim certainly not to increase the divide between the haves and the have-nots. And a problem is that we now are already, for instance, screening embryos for diseases like breast cancer. So if you're wealthy, you can, and have breast cancer in your family, you could get rid of that gene from your kids and their kids. If you're poor, you can't do that. So in the future, a disease like breast cancer that now unfortunately affects both poor and the wealthy, in the future will increasingly just affect the poor. And that is unfortunate because that may mean there's less money being put toward research or treatment for people with breast cancer, et cetera.
There's a term that I was not familiar with, but you can explain it to our audience, PGD.
Yes.
Talk to us about that. And you talk about a patient, you know, you've written a book about genes, and one of the patients you had Huntington's,
yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Or perhaps could develop
yes,
Huntington's,
right.
Because it is passed on.
Yes.
Woody Guthrie, of course, had it.
Yes.
And suddenly this has become like a huge thing.
Yes. Yes. So basically, when egg meets sperm, becomes an embryo that's one cell, that splits then to become 2 cells, then 4, then 8, then 16, and eventually becomes all of us, each of us. And it turns out that when it's around 30, 60, 100 cells, somewhere in there, with still a clump, probably no bigger than a grain of sand, we could remove 2 or 3 of the cells, and we can look at what are the genes inside. So we can say, let's say a man and a woman produce, say, 8 embryos. We can say, well, these 4 are going to be boys, and these 4 are going to be girls. And if you have breast cancer genes in your family, for instance, that increase your risk of breast cancer, these 3 embryos have that mutation and these don't. So which do you want to use? So that process of diagnosing the embryo, so to speak, before you implant it into the woman's body is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD. So it's basically the process of screening embryos genetically. The Huntington's example is, Huntington's, as you say, is a terrible disease, which is a brain disease. Woody Guthrie, as you say, who wrote, this land is your land, this land is my land, unfortunately died of it. If you have the mutation, you will get this disease. 100% chance you will get this disease, and you will die of it if you don't die of something else first. And usually people die in their 40s or 50s, around the same time that their parent who had it died. So if I have it, and it's what we call autosomal dominant, which means if I have it, there's a 50% chance that each of my children will have it, will get the mutation. So as you mentioned, I wrote a previous book called Am I My Genes? Confronting Fate and Family Secrets in the Age of Genetic Testing. And there I interviewed people at risk of Huntington's disease and other diseases, breast cancer, for instance. And a few of the people said to me who had this mutation, they said, the biggest issue I face is, should I have kids? Should I abort? Should I adopt kids? Should I not even get married? Should I screen embryos? And if I abort a fetus, if I test the fetus and decide to abort it if it has my mutation, or if I screen embryos and get rid of the ones with my mutation, I'll have a child without the disease. But what am I saying about my own life? That I would have been rejected. I would have been aborted. I would have been one of the embryos that's thrown out. But I've had a good life even though I have this disease. So what do I do? So that also led me to think about these issues and then to write the book.
Genetic engineering has proven to be a life-saving advancement in the medical field. For example, it's been crucial in developing the HPV and COVID-19 vaccines. But when it comes to genetic engineering and reproduction, are humans prepared psychologically for these new options?
One of the things that I find interesting is you talked about the complex journeys that all these people were on, and then you say how you were surprised at how initially you didn't know as much as you thought you did.
Yeah.
What were some of the surprises along the way?
Yeah, a lot was surprising to me. So one was how complicated it all was. Second is the many variations. So you can, screen an embryo for a gazillion different things, for disease. You can screen an embryo for the sex, male or female. You can buy embryos, you can buy a sperm, you can rent a womb, you can adopt, you can buy and sell whole embryos. There are places that have refrigerators full of embryos and you buy the whole thing, one-stop shopping, so to speak. But also the pain, and you mentioned this earlier. So women told me that having a miscarriage was like having a child die. And that also for a lot of women, this is an enormous source, a lot of parents, enormous source of meaning in their lives is to have a child. And I get that people say, I always wanted to be a mother, and this having, I think, a child and bringing new life into the world, this is tremendously meaningful. And if I can't have this, and all my friends have this, and my parents are saying, when am I going to have grandkids? This is enormous suffering that people face and endure.
You're a professor. Do you ever think, as you look out across the expanse of your student body sitting there listening to you, that at some point, maybe 10 years from now, 20 years from now, this kid could be related to this kid and they have no idea?
Well, I've not had that thought, but that is the future. Because with companies that do direct-to-consumer marketing of genetic tests like 23andMe, people are finding out that they're related to people all over. And again, this is an area where there are no regulations. There are very few regulations. So the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, which is the doctors group, says you shouldn't create more than 25 children from one sperm donor in a population of 80,000 people. Well, that's sort of arbitrary. And then people move, and what does that mean? And there are no, up till last year, no records were kept. Now the ASRM recommends that clinics at least keep records of who's been created, but before that, and still most egg and sperm donation is anonymous. So unfortunately, there are people today, if they do find out that they were created by an egg or sperm donor, they'll probably never be able to find the person unless they do 23andMe. Wow. So this is good, partly because of the genetic testing available directly, 23andMe, this has upended the whole thing. So now people are finding out that, in fact, their father's not their father. They have 50 brothers and sisters. And what does that mean to someone to have 50 people? And some people meet and feel this great kinship, for instance, and also may feel betrayed. Why wasn't I told about this earlier? So these are all very complicated issues. We're redefining family, redefining genetics and relationships and kinship and motherhood and fatherhood, and those are big issues.
Globally, reproduction is big business. In the U.S. alone, the assisted reproductive technology market will be worth, by some estimates, more than $45 billion by 2026. In China, since the easing of the one-child policy in 2015, there's been increased demand for reproductive procedures. Chinese women are also seeking services abroad and driving the global fertility industry boom.
One of the pieces I want to get into is the business of babies, because you kind of really dive into that. And I'm just going to read from page 79. I went for IQ. Valerie, a psychotherapist and single mother by choice, said about how she picked a sperm donor. And you tell her story, and to me it was fascinating. I mean, and it gets down into the weeds. I mean, she could listen to the voices of the sperm donors to see what kind of voice she liked. I mean, talk to us about that.
Yeah, so we now have a market where you could get whatever you want. So there are sperm donor companies in Europe and the United States and elsewhere. There are egg donor companies, as I said, here in the US and a few other places. And you pick what you want. So you could say, I want IQ. I want to have a Princeton PhD who has perfect scores on his SATs, and that's what I want. And so you may want that, and unfortunately, as told in the story, she ended up with a very bright kid who has no social skills. There are sperm donor companies, and they're all online, anyone could look, where you pick what movie star you want the kid to look like. You could pick, do I want Brad Pitt? Do I want Gary Cooper? Do I want Tom Hanks? So you pick whichever you want, and they have sperm donors matched to look like that. But of course, it's, as they say, a crapshoot.
Egg donors, same sort of story, right?
Yes. So egg donors also, there are websites, eggdonor.com, et cetera, things like that. And there are drop-down menus, and you pick hair color, eye color, type of hair, skin color, religion of the donor, height. You could pick their profession, what kind of job they have. The prices of eggs go up with the woman's SAT scores, for instance. So this, of course, gets into the realm of eugenics. And has overtones, begins of overtones of potential racism. So eugenics, the Nazis took to horrific ends. The Nazis decided that Hitler wanted to improve the genes of Germany. We were going to do what we can to improve the genes of Germany. So we're going to get rid of all the people who had bad genes, all the gypsies, the Jews, the homosexuals, people with disabilities, so they all got killed. So this should be, I think, a haunting reminder of the dangers we can get into when we start playing God in these ways.
In 2018, the birth of twin girls sparked a global controversy. Chinese researcher He Jiankui used the gene editing technique CRISPR on their embryos to make their cells resistant to HIV. Although DNA editing is not new, what CRISPR does is pass on that particular trait to all future offspring. This human germline engineering is currently banned in some form in more than 40 countries. With CRISPR, It's impossible to tell if only that one trait was altered, or others too, that will only be known later in the person's life.
Tell us about CRISPR.
Yes. So CRISPR is a new technology that people have described as being a genetic scissors. So CRISPR was discovered largely in yogurt, actually, about 20 years ago. And it was found that the bacteria in yogurt, and yogurt is made from bacteria largely, if infected by a virus, those bacteria were able to cut the genes of the virus out and get rid of it. When a virus infects you, what happens, the virus puts its DNA, its genetics in your DNA, and you then reproduce the virus's genes that produce more viruses. So someone figured out, well, if the bacteria are able to cut out genes for virus, maybe humans can cut out genes. And so they quickly found out that other animals also could be arranged to cut out specific genes. And then around 4 years ago, there was a Chinese scientist who announced that he had now been able to do this in human embryos. So it's one thing to look at cutting out genes in fruit flies or in bacteria or in mice, but when you start talking about humans, it changes the game. So he said he had cut out genes in a human embryo, but not implanted the embryo into a womb, into a woman. Then in November of 2018, Dr. He in China, in Shenzhen, announced that he had in fact created children where he had edited the genes and had in the embryo into a woman, and actually embryos, and produced twins. And this created a furor because gene editing presents a whole other set of issues, and particularly gene editing in humans. So one problem is that the technology is still new. So I said it's like a genetic scissors, and the idea is that you say, look for this bit of DNA here and go, and when you see that, just cut it out. The problem is that the technology isn't quite perfected, so he in fact cut out too much DNA, right? So instead of cutting out this, you cut out that. So that's a problem because you may be affecting the child, causing other kinds of harm. So it's not been proven to be safe in humans yet. This is the problem. The issue is that the notion of being able to affect human beings is something that has a long history going back centuries, like the notion of a Superman, of superhumans, of giving you extra strength, of extra intelligence. These are things that appeal deeply in people's imagination, in the public imagination. And so, and there's also, as some people say, money in them their hills, right? So people think there are already fights over who owns the patent for these kinds of things. And so the feeling is that this is going to continue to go forward. And one hopes that we are able to limit the risks and understand the risks before this becomes widespread. And I think looking forward 20 years or even 10 years, these are going to be the questions that we'll have to face.
I hate to do a spoiler alert, but I'll do a spoiler alert. We started by talking about Abby asking you the question. The end of your book is your answer to that question. You elected not to go ahead.
Correct.
How much did you wrestle with this, and how often do you think people are being asked this sort of question and having to grapple with it in it's uncharted territory? I mean, people don't think about, you have to think about a lot of different things.
Yes, correct. So I decided not to be a sperm donor. I decided that it would be awkward to think about having these kids who are related to me that I wouldn't have any say about, that if they want to go off and do dangerous things, that wouldn't be my say. I'd feel responsible. I'd feel a connection. I'd feel an obligation, a duty, but have no say. And it was just too awkward for me. And she also was a lovely person. She's an artist. She's could be a little bit flaky. Not that she wouldn't be a good mother, but I wouldn't always necessarily agree with her. So I thought, just don't go there. It was easier not to. But that being said, particularly since the book came out, a lot of people have told me, gee, I was asked to do the same thing. Or my sister asked me if, I would give an egg to her, or I would do that. And remember, 20% of the world, 20% of America is infertile. So there's a lot of people, and before people want to use a stranger's egg, or a stranger's sperm, most people would prefer to use someone they know. So they may have a family member, but family members can be weird about this. Or some families say, you know, well, I don't want to give an egg to my sister. She's been mean to me my whole life. Or, you know, I want to have a kid. So in fact, there was one case, as I described in the book, where a sister gave eggs and then couldn't get pregnant herself years later. So these issues are changing notions of what is a family and what are parents and what are children, et cetera.
You've given us a lot to think about.